And so good evening, everyone. And thank you so much for having me at this event. It's an absolute honour to be here. And you've already heard about the role that I'm doing on the Labour Front Bench. And I've been asked to speak today about my faith as the first British Sikh woman to become an MP and what role that really plays in my politics. Growing up in Birmingham, my hero was my father, whose name was Daljit Singh Shergill. My dad immigrated to the United Kingdom in the 1960s, and he became a bus driver in Harborne, the old Harborne bus garage, and many of you will know he drove the number 11 bus because it's so famous here. But he later became the president of the first Gurdwara that we have here in the West Midlands, which was the Smethwick Gurdwara, which is on the High Street. It was growing up really in the home of a community leader like my dad in the 80s that I really probably saw the interplay between our faith and our politics. My father just had this incredible ability to tap into our community spirit and channel it to sort of better ends. Many of you will remember during the 80s in Sandwell, there was a recession. And when I look back now, I think about actually how progressive my father was, but actually it was his faith and the concept of Langar, which got him to set up the very first food bank back in the 1980s in Smethwick. And our house used to be, people used to describe our front room as like a railway station. And they used to say, every time we come to your house, there's always these people, like, what is going on? And it was my father, really, because anybody he would meet, whether it was at the Gurdwara, any person he'd meet out, when he was, doing various work, he would say, absolutely, I'll help you. Doesn't matter what it is. And of course, people used to turn up to our house and it might be a form that needed filling in. It might have been some benefit advice, for example. And I used to say to my father, I really don't know how to do this. Oh my goodness, I hope I do this correct. And he's like, no, you must really help other people. And that was really something growing up before I was going to university. I remember my father sitting me down and having this pep talk. And he said, he said, it's all great that you're going to university. It's all great that you're investing in yourself. But actually what matters is, what are you doing for your own community? What is it that you are going to do that's going to make the world a better place? And what's going to be your contribution? Don't end up being a person that just thinks about themselves. And I think that always kind of stayed in my mind, and it kind of helped me understand why my dad was just so open and so inviting when people came into our house. And I think, not just reflective of my household, many households, regardless of which faith or background, when people came to your house, my father was all about the hospitality. Even if you didn't know them, it was about make sure they had a drink, make sure they had something, make sure they felt really, really welcome. And really, it was that kind of upbringing that I grew up in. And so I saw really in this environment how being a Sikh drove my father to support his community, and the way that the faith was able to get him into places and build those trusting relationships and networks with people that only as a bus driver he probably would never have had the opportunity to have done. And the other thing I really loved about my father, and we're going back, I'm talking about the 80s of growing up and the 90s, he really understood the value of interfaith working back then. And in fact, actually, such was his ability to connect with so many different faiths he supported, whether it was the Bangladeshi community that were going to build a centre locally, he was out there supporting them. But it was wonderful when the Harborne parish actually donated funds to what is now the Gurdwara in Smethwick, because that's how my father really connected out with all faiths, wanting to show that sense of solidarity and how we come together and really support one another. And actually, there's a wonderful story, because the Gurdwara, when it was bought by the community, it was a church, and it was going to go into receivership. And so the banks would have taken it away. And I remember the community coming together, putting the money in. And the thing that everyone talks about, when school children come and visit, they tell them the story. They say, we as a Sikh community feel really lucky that we have absolutely been able to have our place of worship, which was once a church. Because for us, this was a place where there was spirituality, where there was the name of God. It doesn't matter which community or which faith was practicing that, but the very idea that actually this is now a place of worship and a place of God that is open to everybody, no matter which faith or background you are from, is just a really positive and wonderful thing that the Sikh community can celebrate, and is great. In Sikhism, as many of you will know, because there's so many of our communities here in the West Midlands, we practice seva. So it's known as selfless service. And it takes forms, many different forms in terms of what that service looks like, from charitable and community work, But my dad really took this to a whole new level. I remember when there was a recession, and opposite the Gurdwara, what is now the railway station, on the side of there was a factory that sold cheese. And there's this wonderful picture with my father and these women that came to the Gurdwara. And what he did is, during the recession, they bought loads of cheese, the community did, and they put it in this white van and they drove around Sandwell, distributing it everywhere. And I remember we were getting fed up, like, how much cheese and potato pie can you really eat? And how inventive can you be? And, but I mean, this was the sense of community spirit. It was wonderful. People would come out on the streets and get their block of cheese. And I remember it as a little kid. And those sort of things really, really stay with you. And he was so progressive, my dad, that, during that time when we were growing up in the 80s and 90s, of course, there were lots of women that came that got married to Sikh men that were living here in the UK, and they left their homes back home in India, in Punjab, and they came here. And so language was a real barrier for many of these women. But of course, there wasn't the support services that we see now. There wasn't the terms of domestic abuse, of issues that people were facing, especially women, for example, suffering in silence sometimes and not knowing who to go to. And your place of worship really was your community, was really your sense of getting your support, whether it was on welfare issues, whether the police were undertaking surgeries there, whether eventually the council came to provide some support services. That's essentially what my dad did. I remember Bob Dunn, one of our local police officers, and he's still around today and really good friends, he used to come to the Gurdwara and have a little office and a little space and be able to really connect with the community. And that was how my father was. He wanted, our place of worship to be a place of being very open, but also inclusive, but able to meet the needs of the community, because he recognized that they were huge. And that was really the beginning of how you then work with the city council and other partnerships in terms of making sure that your community has what it needs. And so his progressiveness, I remember he set up this committee in the Gurdwara, and it was called Samaj Sadar in Punjabi. It's basically about helping your community almost on issues that they are facing. And what this committee did, there was like 5 men, and if a woman came to the Gurdwara and complained about how she was being treated by maybe her husband or in-laws and how difficult things were, maybe she wasn't being able to keep a wage packet, and these were the sort of issues that people were raising at that time, he would turn up to their house and say, this is really awful that you treat someone's daughter like this. Her parents are not here. We'll shame you in the community if you continue to do this. Thinking back now, and you think, my goodness, you couldn't get away with doing things like that. But actually, he would take me with me. And I remember going to someone's house once. It was really late. I was at college. I was probably 17. And he said to me, you're going to go and talk to this woman. And it's really important that you make sure that, you write down everything she tells you. And if she's in trouble, then it's really important you make note of that, because we're going to try and help her. And I was like, yeah, that's great. And I remember talking to this woman, and she was sharing her concerns. And you probably never really understand the value of the work that my father was trying to do and how important that was. It's only much later on, when I myself went into becoming a social worker, that you actually understood, goodness, these services, these terms actually didn't exist, but our community had to provide these support services in a way that, maybe now we'd probably frown upon or think, oh my God, that's not the appropriate way. But actually back then, it was much needed, and it did have the impact that it was supposed to have. And, so I remember I unfortunately lost my father before I became an MP, and it's so heartwarming when I go to the Gurdwara now, and I hear so many women, especially, that come up to me and say how much they tell me stories about what my father did and the difference he made to their families, or the fact that he just spoke to people so kindly, and they say, we've never had a president that just made us feel like we were so important and mattered, because that's how your dad was. He made all of us feel so inclusive and so part of this, not just the Gurdwara, but the sense of community. And during the pandemic, I think, what we've seen here in the United Kingdom, around the country, really coming together with Marcus Rushford, with his Free Schools campaign, but actually our communities have donated to our local food banks. In my constituency, I'm so fortunate to have so many churches that are so active. St Boniface in Quinton, for example, runs a regular food bank, as do so many other churches across the constituency. And, it is so much needed. And I hear from constituents that they've been able to be part of going back into the church, for example, or being able to be part of a sense of community when they've felt really, really isolated. And we've seen the Sikh community as well go that extra mile. We saw it with Khalsa Aid distributing food to lorry drivers that were stuck in Kent during the Christmas and the Brexit pile-ups that we saw, but we also see it locally with organisations like Midland Lugger Seva. And the value of communities pulling together and really doing things for themselves to support one another in times of needs is something I think we should all be inspired by and seek to harness in our politics. And it's certainly something that I take a lot of inspiration from, because it's strong networks that people like my father, and I hope now I have been able to create, that really build that sense of resilience in our communities and make us feel that we're able to weather these crises where the government of the day really has fallen short in some parts. I'm not going to make this party political. It's really what the Labour and cooperative parties, of which I am a part of, were founded to do. And so it really reflects some of my values and principles. I know that in some respects we try in Britain to scrupulously keep sort of religion and politics separate from one another, but we only need to look at some of the bloodiest conflicts in our history to really understand why that is. And in 2021, we have become a decidedly secular and multicultural society, which is in many ways, I think, something that we ought to celebrate. And as individuals, however, who are people of faith, I think we all have to find our way of navigating our personal sense of politics and justice and the challenges that that poses to us in our everyday lives. And for me, the role of my faith in my politics is really not in question, because in Sikhism, Guru Har Gobind, he taught us the concept of miri and piri, a sense that faith and politics actually goes hand in hand. And the concept outlines really how we not only seek spiritual enlightenment in our faith, but it's also about how we put our values into practice. And I think that is so, so important for me. For Sikhs, our religion's founder was Guru Nanak Dev Ji, the first Sikh. He preached the fundamental importance of equality, of justice and peace. And it means we need to reach out to others. We need to work across divides. We need to build coalitions united in the fight for a much, much fairer world and a much more fairer society. And there's a wonderful story about Guru Nanak, how, he disappeared into the river when he went to wash, and for days he was not found, and he reemerges. And what he generally says is that there is no Hindu and there is no Christian. What he was actually meaning was that beneath our many surfaces and identities, humankind is actually one. When we say Ek Onkar, what we mean is we are one with everything. In his life, Guru Nanak Dev Ji, he taught us that there is one fundamental barrier that we all must each overcome, and that's Homme, which really literally means I myself, as in the ego. And his is a message that says, we're not individuals that should struggle against one another, but we're a global community who have a duty to each other to fight injustice and division and promote harmony, equality and peace. And the teachings of the Gurus reminds us really that the human race is one under God, and we should all really work towards the well-being of all. In frontline politics, though, the sheer volume of demands and work you have to manage can really be quite overwhelming at times, I have to say. I find that as one of only 2 Sikh MPs in Parliament, one of the real challenges is having to juggle that sense of responsibility to represent the whole of my community, because obviously I have my own constituency as well. And it can certainly be difficult when being on the front bench, when people say to me, why haven't you spoken on the farmers' debate or this Sikh issue, or why didn't you raise this issue for the Sikh community? And obviously what being on the front bench means is actually I'm not able to speak on any debates in Parliament other than actually in my own brief. And people don't often understand that from my own community. But in those moments when it gets too much, it's really, really important for me to have those moments to actually catch my breath, to reflect, listen, prayer, or actually to be able to go and sit in the Gurdwara, because actually that really gives me a sense of, myself and that connection with myself. And I think my faith really does help me to reconnect to the world and really grounds me. So in the Sikh faith, we believe that God is in all living things, and we've got to recognize that he exists in all living things. He exists in all of us. And that is what connects humankind and makes us one with everything. And it's this that I keep with me, and it gives me a sense of belonging in the world and security in who I am. I'm going to probably end it there because I could probably speak loads, and I'm sure I've done my 10-minute time, but thank you so much.